So, with all of that said, let's move right into it. We're going to keep this very informal. There'll be a couple of slides that'll look complicated. I promise you they're not. I'll try to make sure that they're explained in a way that's clear. And really do what Robbie said at the outset, which is demystify to the degree that it can be this disease. Now, the first thing is a scary statistic, and that scary statistic is that 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women will, during the course of their life, develop a diagnosis of cancer. Now, that may make you think that this is exploding and it's becoming a problem that's totally out of control. But the fact is, the reason the incidence of cancer is so high is our colleagues in other areas of medicine have done so well. We are living much, much longer, and I'll explain to you why that's an important thing when it comes to the causation of cancer and the occurrence of a malignancy in the body. The statistics have shown that probably in the 1800s, women lived into their 4th or 5th decade. Many died in childbirth or after that, or infections that occurred in the postpartum, peripartum area, region, and that took a large toll. Enter the discipline of obstetrics, enter the disciplines of infectious disease, which was the next thing. There was a time when a diagnosis of pneumonia was as terrifying to a patient as a diagnosis of cancer. It was almost uniformly fatal until there were sulfa drugs and subsequently penicillin, and then the whole series of drugs you all know about known as antibiotics. So people, by the end of the 18th century into the 1900s, began living into their 5th and 6th decade. Our colleagues in the field of medicine really and cardiology began to realize how to better control risk factors that cause cardiovascular disease, which was a #1 killer. And controlling hypertension, controlling cholesterol, diet, activity, really made that a disease that started to fall in terms of a major killer. It's still a very high incidence, but as we've learned more about how to manage those things, people have now lived into their 6th, 7th, and 8th decade. And our colleagues in endocrinology have learned to manage as a chronic illness things like diabetes that previously would cause significant morbidity and mortality in people. And so now women, who always have the advantage, live in their 9th and 10th decade, many, and men into their 8th and 9th decade. Now, why is that relevant for cancer? Well, cancer is an error of genetics. And by genetics, I mean there are changes in genes. Now, this is a cover story that came from Fortune magazine a few years back by an author named Cliff Lee. He's a very distinguished journalist. And this was a shocking cover, and it was Why We're Losing the War on Cancer and How to Win It. Interestingly enough, Cliff Lee himself had a cancer at a young age. He had a Hodgkin's disease that was dealt with at the National Cancer Institute, and he had a very advanced form of Hodgkin's disease that used to be uniformly lethal, but because he was on a clinical trial, he ended up being cured of his disease and still is active in writing and pointing out our shortcomings all these years later. So, but what he says in this article is very interesting, and many of the things he says I completely agree with, some I disagree with, but he's talking about the way we previously approached understanding and treating cancer, which we hope to clarify a bit tonight in terms of where we're going in the new areas. Now, what is cancer? Regulated cell division is an amazing thing. It is unbelievable that things don't happen much more frequently in the body because of what has to happen when a cell divides. Think about what happens in the simple thing of fertilization to birth. You go from a single cell to, in the newborn, between 1 and 5 trillion cells, all in the right area of the body, all associated in the right organ, all functioning the right way, all coming from a single cell. And that single cell had a blueprint. And that blueprint was your DNA, half of it coming from the maternal side, half of it coming from the paternal side, 23 chromosomes from each, which is why you see the ads on television, 23andMe, which may have some limited use, but so I don't recommend it, but that's what that's all about. And but growth doesn't stop at birth, tremendous cell growth. Because as an adult, you go up to 50 to 100 trillion cells, all coming from that single cell. And when you think about the Dolly the sheep experiment, you really realize the amazing thing that happens in a cell. The blueprint, the DNA for you as an individual, or Dolly the sheep as an organism, has to be copied with complete fidelity, without any errors, with exacting precision, and passed on to the daughter cells all through the body. So from that first cell, where you got the initial components, you end up with 50 to 100 trillion cells. And unless you think that that growth stops, just during the course of the day today, many of you will have made some 15 to 16 billion new white cells from your bone marrow to help protect you from an infection. Should you come in contact with something or somebody that gives you an infection, there is a signal that goes out from other cells in the body that says we have an infection, we need to defend ourselves. It goes to the bone marrow. The production facility for those cells will ramp up. There are growth factors that are secreted by these cells that identify the infection. They go to the cells that fight the infection and cause them to proliferate, to grow. And you go from some 14 to 15 million cells up to 50, I said million, it's billion cells in the course of a 24-hour period. And those 50 billion cells will take care of the infection. That's why you have elevated white counts with infection. And when they do, the signal goes back out that the infection has been cleared. And if everything's working normally, the bone marrow goes back to producing just the normal 14 to 15 billion every day. The same happens with red cells. The same happens with some lymphocytes. And the same happens in many organs of the body, although others don't have as much proliferation. Unfortunately, the brain doesn't have as much proliferation. The heart muscle doesn't have as much proliferation. But even those organs have cells that can be regenerating the tissue. But all areas of the body have the capability of proliferation. But it's carefully orchestrated proliferation, carefully regulated, carefully controlled. All the women in this audience know that the breast, which we'll talk about a bit tonight, is one of the most dynamic organs in terms of growth, in the sense that premenopausally, it changes monthly under hormonal regulation with the menstrual cycle. In anticipation of a pregnancy, there's proliferation, enormous amount of proliferation of the specialized cells in the breast that are the cells that are responsible for causing the disease breast cancer. And those cells will proliferate, get ready for a pregnancy. If a pregnancy ensues, there is even more proliferation. And the cells then specialize for lactation, to produce milk. The thing that defines us as a species is this organ. When breastfeeding is finished, there is involution of the cells. A signal goes that we no longer need this many cells, and it goes back. That process is going on in multiple organs of the body. The largest organ in your body is the skin, and that is turning over every couple days. The entire gastrointestinal tract, the lining of the lung, these are all cells that are proliferating. I've told you about the bone marrow, this, to name a few. And if this is orchestrated correctly, there's no harm and no foul. But if the genes that regulate the growth of cells get broken, then you can be off to the races, because then you have dysregulated growth, or the process we know as cancer. Now, a couple of take-home messages for tonight. All cancer is genetic, but that is not to say all cancer is inherited. In fact, only a minority of cancers are inherited. Only 10 to 15%, but it's related to what I just told you. Every time the cell divides, it has to copy the DNA with complete fidelity. And if it makes errors in critical genes that regulate growth, then you have a problem. If it makes errors, for example, if my cells in the skin are dividing and the genes that code for the pigment in my eye get mutated, no harm, no foul, because those genes aren't expressed or used in my skin cell. They're only used in the pigment cells of my eye. But if the genes that regulate growth in my skin cells are broken, and all the genes are at risk to get broken, then you can have the problem that would develop into a skin cancer. The same is true for every organ in the body. Now, what's amazing is these mistakes happen not infrequently. Now, you can increase your risk of having these mistakes by doing some unhealthy things: cigarette smoking, excessive alcohol, exposure to radiation, excessive exposure to radiation. Some sunlight is potentially beneficial because of vitamin D, but excessive radiation to the skin, these are all things that can really cause increased mutation in the genes and potentially the genes that regulate growth. On the other hand, even if you lived a perfect life, lived in a bubble, ate only macrobiotic food, everything grown without any additives, never were exposed to any carcinogens, the longer you live, every time those cells divide, the more you're at risk for making a mistake in critical genes. Hence the problem that we have is cancer, that we'll have 1 in 2 men, 1 in 3 women developing it sometime during the course of their life, because we're living into our 8th, 9th, and 10th decade. So hopefully that's one take home that you'll know about the incidence when you see cancer statistics and get worried thinking that we have no idea what's going on. We do. We're doing very well in other areas of medicine. If you just look at the bottom panel here in mammals, you go from a single cell out to a late embryo and then ultimately a fetus and a newborn. And this all occurs in 9 months. And remember, I told you, go from a single cell to 1 to 5 trillion cells, all in the right place doing the right things. Here's what happens with a cell. At the top, you see a single cell, and all the sort of spaghetti in the middle is the DNA that is being copied. And when it's copied, it then lines up in the middle, and there are actual fibers that attach to both poles of the cell and attach to the DNA in an exact way and pull that DNA apart in equal amounts. So the DNA is first replicated, so it's duplicated, has to be done correctly, and then the cell divides. Now, before that division happens, there's something else that's remarkable. When mistakes are made, there are things called DNA repair genes and proteins that read these mistakes and will excise them and repair them unless there's excessive damage. And if there's excessive damage, there'll be another pathway that comes on that'll consign the cell to death. So the cell has mechanisms to know there's too much damage to allow this cell to divide and will consign it to death. What nature has found is ways to mutate those pathways as well as the growth regulating pathways, so you lose the checkpoints and you're off to the races again with uncontrolled growth. It's what one of my colleagues likes to call a spell checker. We all have spell checkers in our DNA that check in our cells, that check the DNA. The problem with spell checkers is they work very well up to about age 35, and then you're off warranty. And the reason you're off warranty is nature has seen fit to put in place these really great spell checkers long enough for you to replicate the species, and then you're off warranty. Now, I'm long off warranty, so that doesn't mean it stops working. It simply means the spell checkers work less efficiency. Back to my original point in terms of demystifying this disease. The longer you live, that benefit puts you more at risk to have the spell checkers work less effectively and have a risk of developing a mutation in a critical gene. So there are accelerator genes, and these accelerator genes are called growth factors or growth factor receptors, or the wiring that are connected from the growth factor receptor down to the nucleus. The nucleus is the control center of the cell that tells it what to do in all its functions, and all the DNA that is the blueprint for you is in that nucleus. Growth factors and growth factor receptors encode proteins. It's the proteins that actually do the work, but the blueprint for the protein. So in your house, the door is the thing that actually works, or the window is the thing that actually works, but there's a blueprint that called for that door or called for that protein, and that's what the DNA is. And the actual action part of what's going on is the physical door or window. The same is true with these proteins. There are signaling pathways, and I'll tell you what those are in a moment, that connect the growth factor receptor, which sits on the outside of the cell and receives signals from the outside, to the nucleus. And then there are transcription factor genes, and these are genes that turn on the cassette of genes that make the cell work to go into cell division and do it correctly. Those are the accelerator things, and using a car analogy. But if those can be broken, I already told you in the bone marrow story that, you know, when you have all the infection and the cells go way up, it have to be shut back down. When the infection is cleared, there are genes that are brakes, and they encode for proteins that are suppressor, growth suppressor genes, also known as tumor suppressor genes. They were first identified because they suppress tumor growth, but in reality, they're not there for suppressing tumor growth, they're there for suppressing normal growth. There's a signaling pathway attached to them, which is the wiring that goes from them to the nucleus, and any of those things can get broken. So there's a fire brigade of molecules that pass the signal down to the nucleus. And if you break one of those, the wiring's abnormal, and that can send abnormal positive signals for growth or negative signals shutting off the brakes. In some cancers, both sets of genes are broken. The accelerators are broken, and the brakes are broken. So you can imagine what kind of problem that is in terms of proliferation of cells. And the transcription factors, as I say, are those that regulate the whole thing. So cell division, cell turnover continues through our whole life. So that's sort of one of the major things to think about in terms of what causes cancer. Remember what I said, you can accelerate mutation rates by doing unhealthy things like tobacco. It's no accident that lung cancer for tobacco users is markedly increased, because the first thing that comes in contact with that carcinogen is the cells that are proliferating, lining the lung epithelium. And if they get the right damage, you develop a lung cancer. The other cells that excrete the carcinogens that are in a cigarette are in the bladder, so bladder cancers are much higher. The cells that line the head and neck are much higher, so those incidences go up. So it all makes sense biologically.